welcome everyone to Talking Politics, a virtual series that is jointly organized by the University of Chicago Center for the Study of Communication and Society and the University of Colorado Boulder's Program in Culture, Language, and Social Practice, and Brown University's Department of Anthropology. My name is Mervenur Çetin. I'm a second-year PhD student at University of Colorado Boulder Communication Department, and I will be the moderator and discussant for today's webinar. I want to thank all of you so much for joining for this third edition of Talking Politics, where experts examine how language and other media shape the nexus of race, history, and political institutions. This year's edition primarily focuses on the run-up to and the aftermath of 2024 US presidential election, but our programming also tracks the global movement of political discourses, media, and messages. Today, we are very happy to have Nathan Schneider from University of Colorado Boulder Media Studies giving a presentation entitled Governable Spaces and Democratic Design for Online Life, which is also the title of his recently published book. After the presentation, I will provide some discussion comments, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. To ask a question, you may look for the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click the button, a new window will pop up where you might post a question. And we encourage questions at any time during the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many of them as we can after the presentation. However, we understand that politics is a delicate subject, and to encourage a constructive and fruitful experience for everyone, including our presenters, we will be moderating the discussion as well as removing any inappropriate or unconstructive content from the Q&A section. Without further ado, let me pass the time over to Nathan Schneider for today.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for making it this evening. If it's evening for you, it is for me. The sun went down here in Colorado, and I'm really grateful for the chance for this conversation. Let me get the sharing going here. Oh, can you unshare and then? Great. Okay. Can you all see the slide? Right. Again, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really grateful for the chance to share these ideas. And I want to first just acknowledge where I am, which is in Boulder, Colorado, the historic land of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people, and that we are on networks that travel across land and expend energy and carbon and water and really vital resources that we should be attentive to stewarding as we think about governance more broadly. I'm going to share from this new book of mine, Governable Spaces. The book is available open access, so you can go to the link or QR code that you see on your screen and get it for free. My recommended way to read it is to download it, the PDF, and print it out, blown up a little bit, so the text is nice and big. The colors are the pictures are in color too, and the pictures are going to guide us through this session today. I'm going to walk through the book with a particular focus on the illustrations by Daria Medic, who's a really remarkable artist and digital artist and also media scholar, someone who I worked with in the course of developing this book, mainly in the basement that is the Media Archaeology Lab here at CU Boulder, a lab full of old and still functioning machines that has continually fed my thinking and my work. So the story here, in some respects, begins with conversations with my mother. Some years ago, um, I happened to be running a large email list of people who are trying to do things together around the world, about 500 people. And I happened to be the one running it, not because anybody had decided I should be, but because I was the one who started the list. And so I had, according to the platform that we used for the email list, a standard open source platform, the all the admin power over that list. And when one person on the list started kind of annoying other people and behaving badly, as people do on the internet, I found myself as the person who was going to be held responsible for what to do about this problem. And at the same time, I was having conversations with my mother, um, and she had just been elected president of her neighborhood garden club. And as she was describing this experience and what she was doing in this garden club, a group of, in this case, women who meet together to share their gardens with each other and share tips and do charity stuff, I found myself really jealous. Wow, uh, they actually had bylaws in place that told them what to do when the kind of easy flow of communication broke down. Here were rules that held her as president accountable, that made clear how power would flow through the organization in ways that I realized I had never seen in an online space that I'd been part of. And certainly those rules were not in place in the context that I was trying to work through a problem in. Now, this could just be a kind of um, unimportant story about little clubs that people belong to. But if you look at an important legacy in democratic theory, actually, it really matters what we do in these kinds of clubs. And thinkers like Alexis de Tocqueville, W.B. Du Bois, more recently, Adrienne Marie Brown, uh, Robert Putnam, have argued that what we do in our everyday lives, how we organize ourselves at smaller scales, are deeply important for democracy as a whole. And when we do not have those spaces of the practice of democracy in everyday life, that's a problem. And I think we all recognize now that increasingly our life of organizing and of finding community and civic associations is increasingly happening online. And if that is the case, what happens when we are actually organizing in very different ways? And I'm going to argue that perhaps even the rise of authoritarianism around the world and here in the United States has been, in some respects, aided by the little authoritarianisms that we experience online. And that the best defense of democracy is not simply to reinforce existing structures, existing institutions, but to actually take the opportunity of online life to deepen our practices of democracy in ways that we couldn't even do in our garden clubs or centuries old governmental institutions. So a key concept framing this story is what I came to call implicit feudalism. Now, feudalism is a caricature of a concept that was invented after the Middle Ages in order to insult it. But it's actually this caricature that I want to draw upon here because I think it actually captures what goes on in many online spaces. It doesn't reflect, for instance, the kind of maddening and sometimes wonderful complexity of organizational life in the European Middle Ages. It is the caricature that I'm drawing on here. And the implicit is there because many of the people who practice implicit feudalism do so while saying and believing that they are practicing a form of democracy. And so the implicitness is in that it's the practice is in some respects disavowed by the meaning making and the storytelling. Nevertheless, it's there, and it's kind of been with us all along in online life. The earliest online spaces where people congregated were what's known as bulletin board systems, essentially computers run out of somebody's house, where people would dial in, not even using the internet yet in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, dialing in on phone lines to interact with each other on forum-like exchanges, again, hosted on a computer in somebody's house. And the people who ran these became called sysadmins, people who were running not only the community that moderating discussion, but also had the server sitting in their house, the computer sitting in their house. They had the power to unplug it at any time. And the norm that emerged was the rules of having guests over at your house. When you do that, it's essentially your rules, or you kick somebody out. And that makes a lot of sense. Again, you're hosting the service, you're expending the energy and the money to make it happen. Maybe you do have some natural rights there to manage it. But this kind of practice has taken hold in and become normal in spaces far more complex than these early bulletin board systems. Essential features of implicit feudalism are the practice, the assumption that all control rests with the admin or the mod. Whoever has that special permission on first a server, or even in a group like a Facebook group or a subreddit or a group chat, that whoever has that power can grant that power to others, but all power emanates from them. They are the lord of that fiefdom, and they exercise that power primarily through censorship and exile. The power is absolute, and the forms of wielding it are pretty crude by the standards that we might expect from other forms of conflict resolution. So this kind of pattern, again, over the course of the 90s and 2000s, starts swelling from being a kind of default practice of informal communities into becoming the default practice of some of the largest companies in the world, where social spaces governed by implicit feudalism, as well as things like Wikipedia and open source software projects, start developing almost always along these lines. There are the exceptions that prove the rule. Like, for instance, I mentioned Wikipedia a second ago. It is in many respects a break from this from this pattern. There was initially, it initially had a more top-down structure. Over time, it's developed into a more participatory community. But once again, if you try to download the software that Wikipedia runs on, MediaWiki, none of that practice of participatory governance is built in. All of it had to be developed against the defaults of the system. Wherever social, collaborative online spaces have been developed, the software assumes implicit feudalism as the default. Whoever controls the server controls the flows of power throughout the social space. And this is, in many respects, a kind of outgrowth of the structure of the internet, that it is built on this architecture of clients and servers. And wherever that server is the kind of the key gathering place for users, it kind of places an obligation on whoever runs that server to have absolute power. They are responsible for it. They even hold legal liability for it in many important respects. And so there's been a kind of reinforcing cycle of technical and legal forces that have imposed and promulgated and deepened this logic of implicit feudalism in our online spaces that has sat in place of the ways that people have otherwise organized themselves in civic associations, such as drawing up bylaws and setting up some basic structures of accountability, knowing in one way or another how power flows. This is a pattern that has extended beyond just the kind of so-called virtual. The practices that we've been cultivating in these online spaces has already been bleeding into political imaginations well beyond it. And it's worth noting, of course, that these online spaces took political imaginations from other contexts already. For instance, a famous early book about one of the most prominent early BBSs had by Howard Rheingold had in its title this concept of homesteading on the virtual frontier. Homesteading and frontier being language taken directly from the practice of colonialism in the American West, the colonization of the American West as the extension of power across supposedly uninhabited territory. And this is the kind of language that gets adopted, and actually the kind of political logic of that homesteading as well, where the basis of democracy is a kind of local autocracy, where a family would enter into a homestead. The patriarch would rule that family from the top down, and they would rule that land, claiming exclusivity of it over it from, for instance, the indigenous people who inhabited that land previously and continued to hold claims over it. And in the context of online spaces, I think that pattern of colonialism has morphed into a new kind of authoritarian logic. The admin seems to have become and seems to be becoming, I think, a new archetype for power in the context of networked politics. And I think it's hard to find a better example of this than Donald Trump. This was someone who came to power not through conventional political pathways, but through the network, through his posting on social media, through his cultivation of a kind of following and direct relationship. But at that time, he was not an admin. That came later, after leaving the presidency, after leaving his first term in office. The first thing he did was become an admin, create an online platform, Truth Social, and hold the power of the admin as a proxy for political power. Now, with this second election, especially with the convergence of both Trump and Elon Musk, we see a further advance of this metaphorical convergence of the figure of the political leader, of the politician, of even the elected democratic leader, and the sysadmin of a platform. And this, I think, is a kind of formation that has been prepared for by our everyday political practices. That when we inhabit spaces that are governed under implicit feudalism by the people who hold absolute power, we trust them with absolute power. We assume that they're going to take care of everything. That perhaps we become more open to a kind of politics that operates that way too. That we trust ourselves less because we don't expect ourselves to have power in a system. We just seek out those who are willing to take on that role of the kind of all-powerful admin. This is in some respect a kind of fractal process, in the sense that the local, the small scale becomes a reflection of what happens at a large scale. And um, at this point, I want to turn toward the major preoccupation of my work, which is how can we cultivate more democratic spaces in online life? And this too, I think, can be approached as a kind of fractal. This is language I take from two key thinkers for me, Adrienne Maree Brown, who is an activist and writer and science fiction writer, who talks about political power very much in terms of fractal relationships, where the small scale becomes a reflection of what happens at the larger scale. Another thinker who used this metaphor is Philip Agri, who was an engineer at MIT who became a professor of humanities at UCLA. Before he left that role and left public life entirely, he left behind a final essay calling for the cultivation of political skills in digital life, recognizing that increasingly our digital systems were teaching us to lose the essential embodied practices of democracy, and called on us to find ways to reverse that tendency that he had seen up close for so many years. For both of them, and for me, everyday life is really an essential site for the future of democracy. To develop this pivot, I look at a couple cases, a couple of spaces where people are practicing attempts to build governable spaces outside of the kind of logic of implicit feudalism. These are very different contexts. These are groups of people who probably wouldn't get along in a room together, but who I think are undertaking really complementary projects in the sense that they are attempting to create forms of self-governance that exist outside the logic of the state, and that are in some respects, in very different ways, native to networks. One is the practice of transformative justice. This is a practice that is deeply associated with Black Lives Matter movement, as well as a longer tradition of the pursuit of prison and police abolition, and pursuing W.B. Du Bois's idea of abolition democracy, recognizing that in his case, the abolition of slavery was not just a negative act, but required the creation of positive institutions to replace it. And activists in this transformative justice tradition seek out practices that enable them to solve conflict, to especially address violence in communities without resorting to police or incarceration. But one thing that is striking about the guidebooks that they have published for how to carry out these kinds of activities is that over and over they insist we cannot trust these processes to our online spaces. And these are people who are very online, who have large followings on social media, and who are, in some sense, influencers whose primary space of activity is often online. And yet they recognize that the online spaces we have are really inadequate for the kind of processes that they believe are necessary in order to address conflict in communities. And increasingly, they've been recognizing that this is a big problem because many communities exist so much online. We need forms of tools that can support the kind of practices of transformative justice. Another context, again, very different, is in the logic of surrounding the technology of blockchains and cryptocurrencies. Again, very, very different. But here again, people are trying to do things like build money systems and contracts and organizations that don't depend primarily on the state. And in the process, they've actually developed and kind of embarked on, the first really major wave of investment and experimentation in the development of tools for governance online. This is because in many cases, these technologies have enabled billions of dollars worth of digital tokens to have to be governed online. And this is because the structure of a blockchain breaks that old logic of the server and the client that I talked about earlier. Because it is a distributed value system, no one entity controls that value, and decisions have to be made both at the level of the infrastructure and on particular projects much more collectively. And so it's forced a kind of um, investment and exploration in the technologies that could support self-governance that we've never really had to create before. And it's been fascinating to see up close how this kind of exploration has happened, and how there were periods where it felt like every week someone would be coming up with a new voting system or a new way of making decisions by other means, because the need was so great to finally figure out how to manage the flows of power online. So I look at, in addition to these cases, a kind of practice of people seeking to increase the spaces of governability in their online lives. I think a lot of this practice is deeply resonant with a long tradition of anti-colonial resistance, resonating also with concerns about digital colonialism and the power of online platforms today. In this anti-colonial tradition, there's been so often an insistence, once again, on the need to cultivate self-governance in everyday life. And I look at some of the ways um, in which communities have attempted to keep that tradition going. For instance, May 1st Movement Technology is an organization that works across the United States and Mexico, managing servers as a cooperative, enabling their members to access online services that they can own and govern. They have explicitly organized the service through cooperative principles with multi or bilingual online meetings, and carefully crafted bylaws, all around trying to reimagine the practice of online life and online infrastructure through this kind of self-governance. This is something that I also try to model in my own lab at the University of Colorado, the Media Economies Design Lab, where we manage a set of tools together and make sure that whenever we come to rely on online services, they're tools that we control together, and that the students can participate in helping to manage and govern, including encountering the glitches and recognizing that when a glitch happens, it's on us to try to figure out. These little practices can open doors toward a wider range of imagination about how we could self-govern our online life. For instance, in MedLab, we've developed a number of tools to help support the cultivation of self-governance for online communities. One example is Community Rule, which is a platform we've developed inspired by the Garden Club's bylaws. It is a tool that just makes it easier for, we hope at least, for informal groups to set up a simple set of rules for themselves. And they can fork other people's rules, which means, copy them and modify them, and publish them to the public site so that others can learn from what they've created. Another project that we've developed and continue to be developing is called Governance Archaeology. We started it out of an artist residency that we hosted, and now has developed into a full-blown research project cataloging diverse forms of self-governance throughout history and across cultures around the world, trying to make more available a wider range of lessons for political practice than often arises when we just look at, one particular political tradition from one lineage in human history. ModPol is a project that attempts to bring digital governance practices to the context of online games. It's a mod for a Minecraft-like game, an open source game that embeds the ability to develop governance practices within groups. And you can create your own or use modules that we've created to make decisions together in groups. So it brings that practice of diverse forms of decision making and governance into the context of a game. Now, a lot of this stuff, might seem, too much on the side of the grassroots and the marginal. What does this actually mean for the world of big platforms that most of us find ourselves in? And here, I think it's really essential to recognize that we're not going to get more governable spaces unless we create policies and infrastructures that will enable them. So often we have adopted a very particular theory of how to solve problems online, and it's informed by implicit feudalism, which is that when something goes wrong, we haul the CEOs of the big tech companies before Congress and give them a talking to, and either embarrass them or embarrass the lawmakers who bring them in with their ignorance. And in that sense, we reinforce the power of those figures. I'm going to suggest that we need to develop policy strategies that actually, excuse me, turn the goal upside down, rather than simply seeking top-down responses, calling on people with large amounts of power to exert power to solve our problems. Instead, we should develop policy that encourages more bottom-up solutions to the problems that we face to enable governable spaces. So, for instance, rather than assuming that the problems of online social media should be solved by, a single CEO or a single big company with one rule book for the entire world, what if we develop policies that assumed that that communities of people should be able to solve their own problems, that ensured that providers of infrastructure to some degree are expected to defer to the people who are closest to the problems that arise, and that they have permission to allow that kind of self-governance. We see that in some respects already happening right now with this latest wave of social media transition, where people are adopting platforms like Blue Sky and Mastodon that actually allow for a lot more diversity and dynamism in how local communities can and individuals can participate in shaping their experiences. And so this is an opportunity for us to rethink how we incentivize companies to solve their problems in the same way that we don't try to solve problems with local school boards or local crime and that sort of thing with one size fits all solution from the top down. We instead encourage the cultivation of local democratic institutions. We should do that in our online lives as well. In context of digital labor, we need to do so much more in terms of enabling people who are contributing labor platforms to form power in those contexts, to form unions and forms of worker organizing that are really amenable to online life and online organizing, as well as enabling workers to own and govern their own platforms. Similarly, at the level of infrastructure, we've seen over and over that community-owned and governed infrastructure can be far more cost-effective and powerful than those infrastructures controlled by monopolistic corporations. And yet, except in some cases, it's very hard for those communities to get to the point of having that kind of power. Now, running through this is actually a need for policy, particularly in the context of financial regulation. Right now, in cases like workers governing their own platforms, this is something I've been working on for many, many years, and local infrastructures, and even social media communities. Groups of people really can't access the capital to build their own power and to solve their own problems. And so in a book that is focused on the flows of governance and even the user experience of particular software tools, I really come down on the need for a change in how we allocate capital as a society. And I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn, for instance, from the legacy of rural electrification and agricultural cooperatives and employee stock ownership plans. We have a lot of good models for how to actually finance large scale as well as smaller scale projects of collective power. We just have to activate those in arenas that we haven't really allowed them in so far. Now, again, this started with kind of humble email lists and garden clubs, but I think this challenge that those things point to calls for a shift that's much broader. When we start to think about democratic practice in online life, we start to actually challenge the hegemony, the dominance of the very idea of the nation state itself as our primary site of sovereignty. And, if we were to be able to be kind of full citizens of our networks, of the tools and platforms that we rely on, we might start to see a shift where our territorial citizenship may not be quite as important, be quite as central to our lives as other forms of citizenship that we might gain. And so in this, I raise the question not only of governance, but of meta-governance. What are the rules that we imagine for the governance of our lives in the future in a world where we are so bound up in these networked polities? And I think there is some really important inspiration to draw from indigenous legacies and diasporic legacies. I draw the language from the Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard of non-exclusive sovereignties, overlapping kinds of belonging and solidarity. These are the kinds of things that I think we might enter into if we were to really enable democracy to take hold in our everyday online lives. This is, a radical set of possibilities, but also something that I think, are increasingly backing ourselves into already. And I end this book not with a roadmap for what that looks like, but simply a recognition that if we took seriously the democratic possibilities of our networks, the capacity of networked life to really challenge the dominance of our current political institutions, as has been promised for many decades, may come to pass in ways that today seem nevertheless quite remote. Thank you so much for bearing with me. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I appreciate your presence, and I look forward to your questions and your feedback. Thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you so much. I just finished reading your book, and the ideas you shared like are really empowering, and I really love that you start the book with the word imagine. That was super nice. I don't know if it was intentional, but that was the first thing that I realized. I'm like, oh, that's super cool. And like while reading the book, you also brought that up, like the convergence, the Trump and Elon Musk. I kind of felt like, like what you're describing in from a more diachronic lens is happening synchronously right now, like in front of our eyes. And I would like to hear, what you think about the migration from X to Blue Sky and Mastodon right now, and like how it overlaps with the points you made in your book.
Yeah, I think it's a really important opportunity. My lab right now is just begun a project called the Open Social Incubator, where we're actually hosting 10 communities from around the world who are interested in developing their practice in these open social networks that are emerging now. When we put the call out for applications, we got almost 200. We were just blown away by the interest and by the really by the power of the stories that people were bringing into this challenge. I think this is a really vital opportunity. At the same time, it comes with no guarantees. I co-founded a cooperatively governed Mastodon server called social.coop. I've gotten to know the Blue Sky team and interact with them. Actually, one of the first book talks I did on this book was with developers of these networks. And so it's been a really important site of focus for me. But there's no guarantees. Blue Sky very much could end up becoming, another tech monopoly or something. Its structure hasn't quite proved that it's preventing that. Um, Mastodon, on the other hand, is very much vulnerable to capture by the giant threads that is starting to federate, to connect with the different Mastodon servers. And everyone else in the ecosystem, for instance, the people developing the software behind Mastodon have just a tiny fraction of the resources that these big companies have. So, and even at the level of a Mastodon server, implicit feudalism reigns supreme. So this new move creates opportunities for sure to develop more democratic practices, and I think there are spaces where that's happening. But it still very much remains to be seen whether they'll break with the familiar mold.
Yeah, like my first impression was, oh, like this is decentralized, like kind of like one of the points you made in the book, and like people are going there. It's like really user friendly. I'm like, we are kind of seeing also, like I kind of feel like when Twitter transformed into X and how the policies changed, we kind of like witness like how implicit feudalism operates, like in a more, like visible way, and people are like, okay, like I'm gonna delete my account and like go and like have another account in another platform. um and I see a lot of questions line up, but I want to ask one more thing and then I'll go and share the other questions. So I would like to also talk about Daria's illustrations. I love them. They look great. I have the impression that there are like three layers almost representing like three dimensions, but also, the like the smaller layer is at the front, but the bigger one is behind, almost like, like these like invisible ideologies of implicit feudalism, homesteading, kind of like encoded into digital spaces that we don't see them. But I was also wondering, like if there are any other meanings that these illustrations contribute to the points you made in your book.
Thanks for that. It was really a wonderful experience to work with Daria. What motivated that was while I was writing the book, I was collecting screenshots of websites, to illustrate what I was talking about. And what I realized is that when I'm using a particular site or app or whatever, like I have a structure of meaning in my head about what every button does and what's significant. But when you look at a screenshot on a page, it flattens the interface. it doesn't come alive in the way that it does for a user who's experiencing it interactively. So what we wanted to do with the illustrations was, rather than try to force readers to, you know, um, uh, uh, be able to, I don't know, assume that readers would know what we think is, or what I thought was important about a particular screenshot, to instead create illustrations that really highlighted what it feels like to be a user in these spaces. And so the illustrations really call out particular aspects of an interface rather than trying to replicate the whole thing. And it was really fun working with Daria on it, who is herself, a really tech savvy designer, and someone we've worked on technical projects before, building websites and interfaces and things like that. So, I really jumped at the chance to work with her, to put that kind of user experience design craft that she already has, and her critical media training and craft, into creating an experience that would be more, would communicate what we're talking about more clearly than just a screenshot that would also look out of date in just a few years anyway.
I love that. I think that was a great decision, because like while reading the chapters, I was looking at the illustrations. I'm like, oh, like that looks really interesting. It's definitely far better than like screenshot, and it's like three-dimensional. It's live. That's great. So I will now like read out the questions. Thank you, Celia. Celia asked the question. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Schneider. I'm wondering about online spaces, not just as governable spaces, but also sustainable spaces for interactions. We are increasingly seeing a rise of AI-enabled bot and spam attacks on forums and social media across the board. And I'm wondering how more open community online spaces can meet that challenge while remaining committed to collaborative and diverse spaces. And she also have a one follow-up question. I'll read that out too. And as a follow-up to my question, do you feel that perhaps the default frame of moderating speech and behavior online may also be part of implicit feudalism that you are talking about? In that sense, perhaps the huge investments by tech companies on AI-facilitated moderation might be going back to such a model of governable space.
Thank you. Really powerful questions. Thank you. There's so much in them, Celia. I really appreciate it. On the question of the AI enabled spam attacks and all this stuff, I think this is just a reminder of the untenability of what Anna Singh calls scalability, which is different from scale. Scalability is the idea that you can grow something infinitely large without changing its basic function, right? And this is the underlying theory of venture capital based tech platforms. Is the whole idea is you can make lots and lots of money because you can do things at very large scale, with relatively low cost for every additional user. This is not how we do most other things in life. Again, when you start a new town, you create a new structure of governance. You don't just import the school board and the police department and whatever from the town next door. You create your own institutions that might resemble others, but they're governed locally. And I think when you don't have that contextual knowledge, you're always going to be vulnerable to abuse, and to kind of rampant abuse. And this is why I think a lot of people have increasingly been turning to what Kickstarter founder Yancey Strickler calls dark forests, group chats, discords, smaller spaces that are more focused and that are more manageable. And I think in many respects, that's good. It's a recognition that this one size fits all model just doesn't work. This was a recognition too that both like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey had after 2016. Zuckerberg, after his apology tour or whatever, launched this oversight board, a kind of novel, kind of bureaucratic structure as a kind of court system to export some of the accountability that he had been holding, recognizing that in some respects, at least over the hard questions of moderation, he had too much power for his own good. Jack Dorsey took a different approach, which was to say, "Oh, Twitter never should have been a single company; it should be an open protocol," and that was the insight that led to the development of what became Blue Sky. So both of them, the masters of the social media universe, seem to realize at the same time, oh, this one size fits all model really isn't working. To your second question, I think we've gotten to a point where these people, now Elon Musk in charge of X and Zuckerberg are starting to think, oh, maybe actually we can do this with AI. Maybe with AI, we really can have scalability. And perhaps to some degree, they're right. Perhaps this kind of technology actually will enable them to exert more one-size-fits-all power. I think the real question is that something that we want? And I think you're absolutely right that with the rise of AI, alongside the firing of a lot of the trust and safety teams that those companies have had, you see a kind of reassertion of the logic of implicit feudalism without needing to try to explore the challenge of collective governance. At the same time, both companies are exploring interesting avenues of collective governance from, X's community notes feature, which I think has some really, really important dynamics of collective sense making in it, and also in the context of Meta, the company kind of quietly has been experimenting with using the practice of citizen assemblies, so picking random juries of users to help make policy together. And this too, I think, is and some of the AI companies have been exploring that as well. So I think there is a possibility in the rise of these latest AI technologies actually to cultivate governable spaces. Though I think the real tendency for the leaders of these companies, the temptation is that AI will just enable them to have their absolute power without the cultivation of the more complex dynamics of local self-governance.
Thank you, Nathan. We have another question from John. John says, as an educator myself, I often struggle to find ways to show and encourage my students to imagine how internet could be different. I'm wondering if there are any pedagogical exercises or assignments you could recommend to teach and show the diversity, both current and reimagined, of online spaces.
It's a great question, and one I would love to take on. We have a course in our department called Designing Alternative Media Platforms, and I keep wanting to. I haven't gotten a chance to teach it yet, but I'm hoping I will. Um, uh, you know, the place where two places where I experience this and try to practice it are one in my lab, as I mentioned before, where I have a small number of students, but we manage our own tools, and I really kind of insist on always using tools when we're building a new website or just chatting with each other or whatever, or sharing files or editing files together, that we are on tools that we co-manage, just to reinforce this recognition that it is possible to use tools other than the ones that are generally available, and ones that we can make decisions about together. And I try to let them in on that process. Just before this event, actually, I was chatting with in our self-managed server, chatting with one of the students about whether we should do a server migration to a different infrastructure. And that getting them into that conversation, I think, is really important. In the context of a large of a large lecture, I do a class called Intro to Social Media with 150 to 250 students. And for that, I run the class partly on, again, a self-managed server. In this case, it's a Mastodon server that is not connected to the rest of the network. And with this, we set our own terms of service. I invite the students to edit the code of conduct and to, at the beginning of the semester, help set their own rules. We might change them over the course of the semester. So it's an attempt to invite them into the experience of a social network that they control. There's a few games also that have been developed. I'm forgetting the names right now. That Mike Masnick, who's actually now a board member of Blue Sky, has developed two games that are about being a trust and safety person at a platform, and these kind of let you in on the experience of the trade-offs that people in those roles are often making. But I would love to compare notes on how to continue to broaden that sense of possibility, because it's deeply important, and it's something I really try to do in my own practice, is always make the effort to try things um, and try to use spaces against the defaults. Try to notice the frictions in how online spaces want us to inhabit them, and try to break those defaults in some respect. How can you use a tool? You might challenge students with this. How can you use a tool in a way that its designers didn't anticipate or intend? That kind of practice, I think, can be really important for opening up people's imaginations.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nathan. Like, that was a great answer. I love that. I'm gonna definitely apply this in my own classes. Roberto has a question. Roberto says, thank you for this talk. I'm curious, what does democratic governance look like in the context of corporate control and commoditization of communicative infrastructure? A technology like blockchain itself is distributed rather than centralized. But I wonder what happens when the platforms that people use to access a distributed tool are still profit-driven.
Good, and this touches on the another question as well about the connection to the corporate context. But let's see. But in the context of for instance, blockchains, I think it's really important to think about economies, and this is something that a lot of online life, especially early online spaces, really ignored. A lot of those BBSs didn't have explicit forms of, some of them were businesses, but many of them weren't. And the assumption was just, oh, maybe someone will donate, or maybe it's just a volunteer project. A lot of open source has operated that way, open source software development. And I think in some respects, the evasion of economy is part of what's reinforced implicit feudalism. To take a historical case, for instance, early on, the online services, the early online services like Prodigy and America Online would actually reward moderators with discounted internet service. So they were essentially paying moderators for their work. And some of these moderators realized, oh, we're being underpaid for the actual work that we're doing. And the US government agreed. And so because it entered into this legal gray area, the norm shifted. And I think actually the power of being an admin became its own payment. And so it became a kind of proxy economy. In the context of blockchains, on the one hand, you have this rampant, scamminess and speculation and all the like worst stuff we see in the headlines about this ecosystem that, are very real and are very much part of what's going on there. But also, blockchains have become a tool for figuring out how to create economic incentives for collective organizing online. I mean, it's an incentive problem, an economics problem that has actually enabled, along with some cryptography, that has kept Bitcoin from being itself hacked, right? Or Ethereum or any of these big blockchains. They rely on economic incentives to actually produce the structure of the network. And in that way, it departs from something that the early web did. In the when the term hypertext comes from Ted Nelson from his book Computer-Lived Dream Machines, in which he envisioned an internet in which, or something like it, in which people would pay for every website that they go to. So it was like an internet with money built in. And that was the idea, that you'd have economic incentive built into the structure of the web. When the World Wide Web was actually created, it was created out of a research lab. And one thing university and public researchers often ignore is economies, because we already have salaries. We focus on we focus on social credit and social standing, social capital, not financial transactions. And so the web was created without that economic layer built in. And I think as a result, we've often let external economic forces dictate the economic model. So I think it's one of the things that's really interesting about blockchains is the way in which they actually take on this challenge of building an economy into the infrastructure of the internet, and enabling economic incentives to be part of the picture and part of the flows of governance, um, in ways that can be really ruinous. And I've written about this and challenged that ecosystem around some of the excesses. But at the same time, I think actually there's something healthy in some respects about building an economy into the fabric of our networks.
All right. Thank you both for the great question and response. Robert has a question. He says, thanks for this really thoughtful and provocative talk. I'm reminded, at least on the surface, of Elizabeth Anderson's critique of contemporary workplace organization in her book, Private Government. She argues that workplaces are typically organized with employers as authoritarian leaders with sweeping power. I'm curious if you think that typical workplaces in the US have exhibit a similar implicit feudalism, and how they might be similar or different from the digital spaces you have discussed.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great reference and really important book. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work, before this book, for instance, has been around supporting cooperative business development, trying to build economic democracy into businesses of different sorts. So the corporate connection, I think, is interesting. But actually, I think there's a respect in which implicit feudalism is not the same as corporate power. Corporate power, a CEO is not an absolute monarch, and a CEO is actually a profoundly accountable person. A CEO is accountable to shareholders. So when we talk about private government, it's private on behalf of the shareholders of the corporation. They have a very specific mission and accountability structure. And often, when I talk to founders, trying to build new companies, the first question I ask is, who do you want to be accountable to? Because the default, is pretty clear. In the context of implicit feudalism, the accountability actually really is not there. Here we're talking about contexts where nothing really holds the leader accountable except people potentially exiting or complaining. But there is no clear accountability structure, in the same way that the caricature of the feudal lord has no clear accountability structure to anyone but themselves. And so it's a little different. But there is a convergence where in tech culture, in these tech companies, corporate governance has actually shifted to adopt more of the dynamics of implicit feudalism. For instance, when Mark Zuckerberg took then Facebook, now Meta, public, he did it in a way where he retained a controlling stake in the company. And this is a pretty remarkable thing to accomplish. Other companies have done it before, but it's not the norm. And I think he did it on the logic that, this is, in some respects, this is how our online communities work. This is how tech companies remain dynamic by essentially ceding all power to one person. And that's been reflected more and more and become more explicit in the discourse of tech culture. Over this past year, there was an essay from Paul Graham, who was, founded Y Combinator, the most influential startup accelerator, called Founder Mode. And it's all about the importance of having this kind of unaccountable leadership in a company to build technology. And that founder mode logic, I think, is really profoundly bleeding into our politics. There is no one who is more founder mode than Elon Musk. And now this is the person who is supposedly being put in charge of the restructuring of the federal government. And so when we talk about private, the relationship between corporations here, I think we really have to make a distinction between the traditional corporate form and its relationship to its shareholders, and the emerging corporate form that is actually very informed by the practices and logics of implicit feudalism.
Thank you, Nathan, for your response. We have one more question from Janice. Janice says, thanks for this discussion. It seems like you're recommending that we relook at online spaces not as infinitely large public spaces, but as smaller spaces for interaction. I have been increasingly skeptical of social media's implicit claim that the only direction for online spaces to grow is only in terms of numbers. If online spaces for large tech companies can be likened to the chaos of public square, should new online spaces be likened to something else, like Habermas's private saloons?
Yeah, thank you for this. I do think that, self-governance requires appropriate scale. But I also, I don't want this to come off as saying, oh, we should have no big networks, only small things. Let's all retreat only to our little salons. What I'm interested in here is just the practice of like subsidiarity, right? Subsidiarity is sometimes caricatured as like do everything at small scale, but no, subsidiarity is all about what is the relationship between the local and the global? What are the right things to do at the global scale and the right things to do at the local scale? And I think we've gotten that subsidiarity profoundly wrong. And for instance, in the context of a network like Mastodon or some of these emerging ones, you have the capacity, a different blend of what's local and what's global. And I think about this. This is something that the cooperative tradition has taught me a lot. For instance, Ace Hardware is a national hardware chain, it seems like. What it actually is a cooperative of local hardware stores that buy their hammers and stuff together. And many of them also use the same brand, so they're recognizable, so that it says Ace Hardware, but it's actually a locally owned store. And here in Boulder, we have two major hardware stores. One is, and until recently, Ace Hardware member, that's locally owned. And one is a Home Depot. And they're profoundly different places. And they're profoundly different because they do scale differently. Home Depot, it's like every other Home Depot. The employees who work there largely don't know very much about the things that they're trying to sell, or they're not really trying to sell that hard. They're very hard to find as well. It feels like a kind of dehumanizing, frustrating experience. But hey, at least it's familiar. The one down the road is locally governed, and it's called McGuckin. it feels like the community in a really remarkable way. The people who work there are very eager to connect with you and help you think through your problem. Many of them have been working there for a very long time. They keep a lot of the selection just feels like, wow, this is like a living stereotype of this community. Um, they keep a lot more decisions local, but they recognize that, hey, we need to buy our hammers in a national network because if we did that locally, we would have to charge way too much for hammers. So they've made those two stores have made different decisions about what to scale, globally and what to do locally. And I think that's one of the things that's so exciting to me about like Mastodon and Blue Sky is neither of them says, okay, we're just doing small spaces or we're just doing a large space. What they do is they have different answers to the question of what should be local and what should be global. And it's that diversity, that openness to exploring how to answer that question differently that I think is really important right now. And that could open the door toward for much more dynamic self-governance. I think we need we need both salons and public squares. The question is, how do we get the right balance of those? How do we make sure that the salons are able to be vibrant and diverse and healthy, and sometimes ruckus and all the kind of underground experience that we need? And how do we make sure that the public square is well governed to meet the needs of the society and to produce that kind of healthy discourse that the society needs? So it's really not, it can't be an either or. It really has to be a question of how do you find the right relationship between those two?
Thank you. I love the example of two hardware stores in here, like Home Depot and the local one. Like it makes perfect sense, what you say. I have one more question. Like reading the book, I feel like you emphasize like community accountability a lot. But like I was wondering, like, is the idea of self-governance you envision centered up primarily on community level, or does it also encompass individual level? And like, how does it look in practice for us individuals?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm somebody who has spent a lot of my career focused on like community things like co-ops and collective governance, who is at the same time a kind of in practice individualist who would like nothing more than to like hide in my office late at night and write by myself, and I value my independence very deeply. It's something I love about life in the university is that you get a lot of that, um, and and so I think it really is important to think about those to think about the individual in this context, not just the context of the the community. And there are two frames for this. One is um, just at the level of system design, ensuring that people, really do have the right of exit. That's something that, for instance, Blue Sky's really been emphasizing, and that people really do have the ability to creatively craft their experiences. Spaces of play, spaces of experimentation are, I think, deeply important in our digital lives. One of, my favorite uh, websites is this subreddit called Unix porn, and forgive the term, but it's basically just one long forum of screenshots of people showing off how they've customized their their desktops, their computer desktops. I love seeing how people creatively craft their digital worlds. I just think it's fascinating to see how they try to hack and break the rules, and that space of personal experimentation is deeply important. Another aspect in which the individual, we can think about the individual is in terms of rights and the ability for people to assert individual um, rights in the context of collective power that may work against them. And a critique that I started hearing while working on this book and that I never really dealt with in the book, and that I'm really trying to focus on in my future work more. It was a critique that came from especially from digital rights activists in India who have been seeing their rights um, eclipsed and attacked by a majoritarian democracy. So the Hindutva movement that is driving the Modi regime is, for many people in India, is an affront to their rights, and it's a democratically elected affront, and it's a reminder that collective decisions are only one part of democratic life, that rights are the other side of it. There have to be limits so that individuals and minorities, are able to survive even in the context of majoritarian rule that might work against them. And so I think it raises really important questions about when we're talking about collective decision making, we also have to insist on what are the means of establishing collective rights online. And this is something that I'm really looking to explore more deeply. I've written a bit about the idea of expanding the range of rights in blockchains, for instance. But there's really a very limited range of rights that we tend to see available through the tools we rely on online. Rights to privacy, for instance, through encryption technologies, in the context of a blockchain, rights to ownership through holding keys to a wallet. But there's a much wider range of rights, say around discrimination or rights to healthcare. Many, many things on, say, the UN Declaration of Human Rights that in our digital spaces, we haven't really even begun to address, especially in a digitally native way. And this is something that I think we need to, while building tools that allow for self-governance and collective decision-making, we also have to make sure to think about how do we build rights into the fabric of our technologies. Again, this is something that the developers at Blue Sky and Mastodon have been thinking about in some really interesting ways. But I think there's a long way to go there.
Yeah, thank you for your response. Yeah, like while thinking of like collective decision making, like I just thought about like an article I read about content moderation in subreddits, and like how collective decisions are made, and like how like you kind of like voice yourself like as an individual, even like in those spaces where like every moderator has equal power. I kind of feel like we should really think about like how can we self-govern as individuals, because this is really important. Unfortunately, our time together is up. Please join me thanking Nathan Schneider for the wonderful discussion today. Our next Talking Politics event will be on January 13, which is titled as Talking Politics with Greg Thompson, Imagine Disunities, Political Ontologies and Political Polarization in the UN, in the US. To receive updates on our upcoming events, please make sure you're signed up to our mailing list at talkingpolitics.org. If you would like to revisit any part of the presentation, or you have friends who couldn't make it today, we will be sharing a link to our recording of the presentation at a later date through our mailing list. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.